It's the Steve Padilla Sessions. I'm Kevin Pang from America's Test Kitchen. Joined with me, as always, by Baxter Holmes. He is the senior national writer covering the NBA for ESPN. And of course, Steve Padilla, column one editor of the Los Angeles Times. Thanks so much for all your comments, all your tweets over the last few months, or actually the last few weeks that we've been doing this, and a lot of positive comments. And this week, we're going to be revisiting a subject that was in episode 3, but it is a topic so nice, we're going to do it twice, and it is all about structure the sequel. We're going to be talking about outlining, talking about how to make the narrative, how to make the story feel effortless, because that's really the goal, is for you to read it and it to feel completely effortless. So, Steve, I want to start by talking about this idea that you had mentioned earlier, but it really resonated with me, which is, before we even get to the structure, it's so important to understand the meaning of the story and narrative. Can you expand on a little bit about that idea?
Yeah, it's weird. I've had reporters who've talked to me about how they thought they might open a story, usually citing some sort of really cool anecdote. But then as we talk, I realized they haven't finished the reporting, and they haven't even nailed down what the real angle is. So I'm like, well, why are we even talking about the opening? We don't know what the point is. Of course, they're already thinking of an opening just because they've got a really snazzy anecdote, and they think they should just open because it's really cool. Wrong. Don't do that. Don't do that at home, kids. If you're gonna open with an anecdote, it should reflect the story. And so I think the key issue here is really nailing down what the main point of your story is. Because I always like to say, if you know what you want to say, you'll figure out how to say it, and you'll figure out how to structure it. But it's so hard, I think, for nonfiction writers, because you got to do all the reporting. You got to have all the stuff. And if you're grasping for that what angle, it's either for two reasons. You haven't done enough reporting, so you just don't know what you're talking about. Or more commonly, you have so much reporting, I won't say too much, but you have so much, you have an abundance that you're overwhelmed. And what's the saying? You can't see the forest for the trees. And that's usually where I come in at the LA Times, because I'm working with some really terrific reporters, and they've got in fact, just before we started tonight, I was on the phone with a sports writer, and he's got all this great stuff and has no idea how to compile it. And so we were kicking around ideas, looking for a universal theme for that story. And so the main thing, Kevin, I think, is when we talk about structure, is remember that the form, that the content influences the form. And so you've got to nail down what your story is before you can really start talking structure. Now, one disclaimer is sometimes we discover the story as we write. I realize that happens, right? But if you can at least have an agenda to get started, that's going to help. So I think you got to know what the point is.
Let's dive in a little bit deeper to that point. So you're looking for the universal meaning. Are you looking for that to be articulated in one sentence? What are you usually looking for as an editor when you're trying to nail down what is the meaning of the story?
Yes, if you can articulate it in a sentence, although if you're using it in a sentence, you're using grammar and you're having to get creative and write, and that usually inhibits you. If you can use a label to embody a story, like love story or redemption or rescue, if you can boil it down to one or two words, maybe one word, that'll focus you. And I think, and Baxter, you and I have talked about this. You did a piece where I think for ESPN, where I think the one word of that story was survival. About that, it was about a town, and it was about surviving through all sorts of trials and tribulations.
When you taught me about that, the concept of you can boil a story down to one word, and that everything in the story has to in some way tie to that theme. It's an amazing way of kind of clearing the clutter in some ways. I mean, and again, you're attached as the reporter because you gather the information. It's very special to you. Maybe you came by some of it hard. You feel like you want to make it all work and whatnot. But then when it comes to the organizing, that technique is great. But you said something a second ago about the discovery through writing. And I'm probably not just speaking for myself here, but I tended to the stories for me, like I didn't know, early on, I didn't know what the ending was. I really didn't even know where they would begin. I would just have a bunch of the material, and then I would kind of look at it and try to figure it out. And it was like discovery, almost sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph. And that is, maybe that worked for some people. I did it for far too long. Every story seemed like took so much out of me because I didn't sit down with any kind of concept of a roadmap, even whether it was one word or a sentence or just like a way that I thought it was going to move. And so storyboarding and outline and trying to come up with a structure beforehand, maybe it's not set in stone, which is, I know what we're talking about today, is something that is new to me, but I can't recommend it enough, especially, and Kevin, I know that you've done a lot of this work, and Steve, you edited a lot of this work. When you have so much material, it is overwhelming. And so trying to find a way to organize it before you sit down and are staring at the blanks, screen with the blinking cursor just kind of mocking you because you have all this other stuff. And how do I make it all, coherent into a seamless, story that someone gets lost in, and it moves so quickly from beginning to end. It's like, going into a great movie and you lose your sense of time. You want a great story to be like that. So the organizing and the stuff like that we're talking about here is, that's been a revelation for me.
But how do you organize it? One thing I picked up from a book that Kevin gave me a few years ago, I think he's got it right there, right? Save the Cat. Save the Cat. It's about screenwriting. And I'm not interested in screenwriting, but the author describes how movies are put together and how you can describe an entire movie in one sentence. They call it the log line. And what's really fascinating is you read this book and he gives you log lines of famous movies, and you read that one sentence and you say, oh, that's Casablanca, or that's Pretty Women. It's just incredible, these single sentences. And so one thing I picked up, and I've become a fiend for doing this with 3x5 cards, which I don't have any of with tonight. And I usually do this on a table. But instead I'm going to use a notepad here and some Post-it notes. So imagine this is my table, and what I do is I don't write full paragraphs or sentences. I usually put maybe 1 or 2 words, and it might say scene in bar, or quote from mayor, or river anecdote, or whatever, just reminders. And I put them on the table, and I look at them, and then although I could type up an outline on the computer, I find it easier to move stuff around because I just go, no, I don't like that. I'll put that one down here and I'll put that one there. No, this would look better. Put this up here. And I just start moving them around real fast on the table. And I just discovered that I guess I process information very just visually. And when the correct pattern presents itself of the 3x5 cards, I go, oh, that's it. And I just stack them and then just work through it. I find it incredibly fast and much easier than typing up and then of course, while I'm doing this, I might realize there's a quote, a segment, something that I didn't put on a card. So I write add a new card and throw that into the mix. And Kevin, do you want to show your cards there?
So
you have an example?
I'm ready to tell what the story I'm working about is, but here's sort of an example.
But if you just show the cards.
But each color is there for a reason, and also it's actually kind of poorly organized, but that I do exactly what you're suggesting there, Steve. I want to bring up one thing that I actually have, the most valuable thing that I've learned from Save the Cat, which we'll put this in the show notes here. It's on page 110. Okay, so for those of you who buy this book, look on page 110. And so the section here, it's marked +/- and then 2 sort of brackets pointing to each other. And I think this is one of the most brilliant things I've read, and I'll explain what that means. So what the author Blake Snyder proposes is that within every scene, the mood or the feeling or the emotion should go from a plus to a minus, or from a minus to a plus, because that way you can get like narrative momentum. Otherwise, like, why is the scene there? What's the purpose of it, right? You want it to go from, in one scene, a person goes from happy to sad, or from excited to nervous, right? So that's the plus and minus. And then the other thing is these brackets that are pointing to each other, right? And what Snyder says is that the other symbol denotes conflict. And I'm just going to read a part from this book here. So understand what the conflict is. I always like to think of a scene like this. As the lights come up, two people walk into a room from opposite doors, meet in the middle, and began to struggle past each other to reach the door on the other side. They enter the scene with a goal, and standing in their way is an obstacle. That's conflict. And I thought that's so brilliant that within every scene, that ideally it should go from the emotion should go from one end of the spectrum to the other, and there should be some sort of a conflict. And conflict can mean a father is at his supermarket and wants to buy food for his kids, and the conflict is he has no money, right? So I actually used that as I was working on that story, his Saving Grace story about the chef that Steve and I worked on, and more importantly for the subsequent documentary that I made, which is sort of thinking about it in a different way, because we only had 90 minutes and we shot 15 hours or 300 hours worth of footage. We want to make sure that every scene was there for a reason, and so every scene in that documentary, which is cheap plug called For Grace, it's on Amazon Prime, had to have a plus to a minus or a some sort of conflict in there. So anyway,
I got to share with you that relates to something I tweeted out today. I like to tweet out comments from authors on their birthdays, and today is the birthday of John Updike, and he wrote this. He said, prose should have a flow, the forward momentum of a certain energized weight. I love that phrase. The forward momentum of a certain energized weight. It should feel like a voice tumbling in your ear. But that energized weight, it's like I say, it just is barreling forward. It doesn't have to go at a breakneck speed. It doesn't have to race down the runway, but it just has to keep going forward. Yeah, that's one of the many good things in that book.
No, what that reminds me of a little bit. I don't know if you guys have seen this. It's a YouTube clip of Kurt Vonnegut.
The Shape of Stories.
There it is.
I love that.
I know you guys have seen it.
We are kindred spirits, Bax.
Yeah. I knew you guys. I love that thing because I think in it, if memory serves, that he says there's like three shapes. There's like three. I want to say like 3 or 4 stories. There's only 3 or 4 that can be told, and the way that the arc moves from happiness to sadness or poverty to prosperity or whatever, and the way and there's like the classic one of up and down or down to up again, which is like Cinderella or whatever, things like that. But so that was he was talking about the shape of like a full story.
By the way, we interrupted you, so we got to make people understand what you're talking about. Because Kevin and I talked over you. He's talking about Kurt Vonnegut, the late novelist. Yes. Kurt Vonnegut was the author, and if you Google Kurt Vonnegut or A Shape of Stories, you'll find him the lecture on YouTube, right?
Yeah, and it's only a few minutes long. It's brilliant. I probably Kevin, I've watched it too many times, but it's interesting because Kevin, what you were talking about with the plus to a minus to minus to plus, that is in its own way, either going up to down or down to up. And that carries not only for the length of an entire story, but so many scenes. And even as you were saying that, I was thinking of like, oh man, there's so many scenes I read where it's like, it starts out and everything's okay. And then all of a sudden something happens or it's like something is really bad. There's a bad fire all of a sudden, but then someone comes in to rescue him. So it goes from, a minus to a plus. And that is the arc of that scene. And then all these scenes are kind of stitched together. And then if you take a step back, you can see what the arc of the overall story is in a way. And it's reflected in that. So it's like these micro arcs and then the much bigger ones and the shapes of stories, so to speak.
Think of it, another way to visualize this is think of it like a flywheel or a wheel, just a simple wheel, right? In order for it to move, for the story to progress, it needs to rotate. So it needs to go from the top to the bottom, back to the top again. And that's how you sort of gain momentum. And you want that wheel to keep moving down the road. That's, otherwise, if I look at a scene and it doesn't have that conflict and it doesn't have that something happening in there, then, I usually look at that and I say, I'll take it out.
Or if you have some detail that maybe doesn't create motion, but it's an important detail, there has to be a reason for it that maybe pays off later. We had a great example of this just the other day. Thomas Curwen did a piece about a woman who had got COVID, and they put her on this special machine that was either going to kill her or save her. And I'm going to give away the ending here. It saved her, but you don't know that as you're reading. But here's the thing: he mentions 4 times in the story, he mentions a white rosary. It was a little plastic rosary that she was given by a nurse, I think, at one point. And he mentions it 3 different times in the piece. And you think it's just part of the color as he describes the beeping machines and stuff. Well, the last, and at one point she loses it. She cannot find the rosary and she wondered whatever happened to it. She finally lives, she comes home, everyone's relieved. She's, amazing, she's alive. And the last paragraph has her discovering the rosary. And she finds the white rosary. And of course, every time he talked about it, he called it the White Rosary. And it just had this kind of rhythmic thing that was cool. Anyway, when you got to that last line and that reference, you're just like, just bursting in tears because it's kind of symbolic of everything that she's been through. And so what I thought was great was, you see this in stories where people will mention something high up or in the middle, and then they echo it at the end. And that's an effective technique. But what's really cool is if you don't want to overdo it, but that thing, maybe you mention it 2 times, in the body of the story, not just once. Here, he actually mentioned it 3 times. But the thing that was really great about it, and we'll provide the link, Kevin, so people can read it. When you see these paragraphs that mention the White Rosary, he doesn't say, "Look at the White Rosary." It just slipped in there, and you're aware of it, but you don't know what's going to happen with that rosary. That it's going to wallop you in the head at the end with some emotional power.
It's literally.
I love echo effects. I confess.
It's like Rosebud, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Wait,
Yeah.
as we're talking about, Steve, you just mentioned an ending, and this kind of fits into figuring out structure and whatnot. A very dear, a good friend of mine, Chris Jones, had talked about, who was a writer for Esquire for a number of years, one of their staff writers. He talked about he always knew what his ending was going to be, and that in some ways, because he knew, like almost like a GPS, like if you know your destination, he knew where to start. He knew how the story was going to move because he knew where it was leading. I was one of those people that for a long time never really knew what my ending was going to be. And now during the reporting process, in some ways, I don't want to say I'm necessarily looking for an ending, but I have my antenna up to try to find what I think might be an ending. So in some ways that I can imagine, almost that it works the structure out a little bit. But as you guys are outlining and storyboarding, which again is something that's relatively new to me, which I started years ago, how do you think of the ending? Do you think of it as like a destination? I'm working to get to this point and it's there all along. Like I know what this final line is going to be. Whereas I don't know. I'm very interested in your guys' process in that way.
Kevin, you want to take that first?
Oh boy. No, I feel like I need to defer to you because it's like it's this is a very cliche answer, but it's like the Supreme Court's definition of pornography. You just know it when you see it. It's like if I see the ending, I know it. I know that, okay, that works, but it's a bit of a mystery to me because like I feel like this is sort of me chickening out, but I have to defer to Steve because you see these stories all the time and you're so good at identifying that's the ending right there. That's where you.
Well, I bet you in working with you guys, I'm sure there were stories where you showed me the tops and I asked you, so how does it end? I will virtually guarantee that I asked you that question.
Yeah.
I think it is useful to think of the ending early on. Now, just to be clear, not the words. Okay, I'm not suggesting that you actually write the ending at the beginning. It's too early for that. But if you just have the idea of the ending, that if you're writing about a drug addict, are you going to end with him on the road to recovery, or end it with him on the road to relapse, or are you going to leave it undetermined? You just don't know which way it's going to go.
You're mentioning a specific story, I think, by David Wharton, and I think you should tell people what exactly it is you're referencing there.
Well, yeah, David Wharton did this terrific profile of a druggie football player named Todd Marinovich.
And this, by the way, David Wharton, a sports writer at the LA Times. We should.
Yes. Who I was talking to just today about a story, by the way. And it ended with a quote, and I encouraged him to end in his voice. And the other thing, it was a very upbeat quote about Todd was going to beat the addiction. It revealed that he was a heroin addict and he was trying to beat the drugs. And it ended with this most horrifying line. And it talked about how that, let's see if I can recall it. It talked about him admitting that it's a struggle to beat the drugs. And it talked about him, if I get this right, that sometimes while driving on the freeway to a meeting or practice, he passes an off-ramp where he used to go buy drugs. The urge arises, the off-ramp beckons. Those are the last lines. I may have
And that's
screwed up
how
a word or two, but it just gives you the chills.
And didn't Todd later after, I mean, didn't he go back into, he fell
Oh yeah,
back
he
into
did. He
drugs
totally
again?
relapsed.
Yeah, and
He
so
totally did. Yeah.
there's amazing honesty in that line, and you're not trying to call,
Mhm.
what's going to happen in one way. You're just like, you're shooting right down the middle. Like, this is it's. I remember when you told me that, I thought, man, I mean, it's a chilling ending, but it is also so honest and real. You're not
And
trying
that's
to
the
paint a
thing. It's
rosy picture.
accurate. It's
Yeah,
accurate. It's not saying he's doomed, but Marinovich apparently acknowledged to him, yeah, I drive past this place and, it just brings back memories. And so it ended in an unresolved chord, to use a musical analogy.
yeah.
And to give an example of what that is, guys, let's think like the end of the song, Happy Birthday to You. Happy birthday to you, right? Okay, so until you do the you, that's unresolved. Happy birthday to, ooh, man, it's really upsetting to not resolve that. And you can do that in writing just the way you can in a piece of music. But the key is that ending was sort of discovered along the way. But I do think if you have a general idea early on, it helps you make decisions along the way. So Baxter, so how do you actually now, so you say you now actually do outline? Do you type it up? Do you do cards? I mean, what's your method?
Yeah, so I typically now have Google Docs. I'll say that, like, on my path to discovery, because Steve, you talked about this at the top. I've read different people talk about like writer's block and whatnot, which I'm not. Writing is very, very hard. It has always been hard. It will always be hard to craft it and say exactly what it is you want to say. But I really do abide by the theory that, or believe in the theory that if you are stuck, it's probably because you haven't reported the story out well enough, or there's a hole in your reporting.
Mhm.
So I think, like, oh, I need to do more reporting, and I try to report something out to the point where I could sit at a bar next to a stranger and I could tell them the entire story in one sitting, start to finish. I know everything like the back of my hand, and we're good to go. Now, organizing that, can be, I mean, maybe I'm just telling it chronologically or something like that. But I now do Google Docs, and I will outline, and and I tend to do it like this. I'll do like, okay, this is the scene that I want to open with, and I want to open for this reason. Like, it's telling and symbolic of maybe what this entire story is about. After that, this nut is going to nut graph is going to kind of clearly explain what it is, and then I want a cliffhanger line that leads into the next section. So I'll kind of break it down by like little sections or chapters. And I've gotten better. Like, I was doing an interview recently, and during the course of the interview, I was like, I think that's my ending. Like, even as the person said it, because it just set off, like, I mean, you trained me and Kevin to have your antenna up, and you're like listening closely for these little things that like ring bells or set sparks off. So I'm doing more of that, of having, but you made a point that I think is also true, and this is where I think maybe some cards would come in handy. My outlines tend to get really long, because I may not just write a sentence. I might put the actual quote in there, and then all of a sudden the outline starts looking like the story itself and whatnot. Like, I'm working on a project now, which I can't talk about, but I sent an outline to my editor, who I'm working on with it, and I think the outline was 11 pages, single space.
Ooh.
So, but it was pretty beefy in terms of like all the stuff that was in there. I saw the ooh on your face, Steve. I know you get all of this stuff. I know I also turned in some lengthy stuff to you at times, back at the LA Times. So
I will say I'm a big fan of the note cards. And a few years ago, I went down to work in person with a reporter and photographer. We rented a house. The LA Times rented a house literally about a half block from the Rio Grande, from the river, the border in Texas and Mexico, in Roma, Texas. And Molly Hennessy Fisk and Robert Gauthier, the photographer, she's the writer and Rob's the photographer, lived there on and off for 4 months. And I went down there in person, not because I didn't trust them, but to really have some quality time to talk through the stories. And I made sure to pack some 3x5 cards. I just had to have those. And on the last day, Molly and I were there in the kitchen at our house, and we were just putting down the cards because we had 4 different stories. And we came up with the approach for all 4 of them. Rob came back from shooting, and then based upon some photographic needs, we rearranged some cards into different stories to accommodate photo issues. What was really great was, in the end, it was 4-part series, and the national editor and then the managing editor did have some suggestions, on wordings and things and little questions here or there. But I was really thrilled that the structures for all 4 stories stayed exactly as we laid them out there on the kitchen table. And I don't think that would have been possible if we hadn't gone through that exercise. And it was a hell of a lot of fun too. It was really, really great.
Well,
actually, Kevin, I want to make a quick point on structure. And you guys know I've hammered this a lot in my lectures, the importance of ending a sentence with gusto, putting the good stuff at the beginning of the sentence, but even better stuff at the end of the sentence, ending with something really cool. And that drives you into the next sentence. Aside from just making the individual sentence cool and neat to read, I find that when you do that, that actually addresses a lot of structural issues because it makes the next sentence easier to write. It's almost like it creates a foundation for the next sentence.
Yep.
And so I find that that thing I preach about, end the sentence with gusto, it has a ripple effect that relates to structure.
From a practical level, the one thing I always remember you telling me, Steve, is that make sure your strongest words appear at the beginning of the sentence or the last word of the sentence. And this is actually scientifically proven. So for example, if I say, try to remember this string of digits, 3, 4, 2, 6, 1, 9, 2, 8, 4, 1, 2. Okay. You probably remember the 3 at the beginning and the 2 at the end. Right. So I think the same thing works if you look at a sentence, like, from a molecular level, right? You remember strong words at the beginning and at the end of the sentence. So that's something that's another Steve.
Well, that's why, I know working with you guys, sometimes you may recall when we'd edit together, I didn't put stuff in or take stuff out. I might just have flopped the order of words. I finally realized that when I was in college, there was this superb editor, professor there, a guy named Jack Langeth, and it took, I wish I understood what was going on at the time, but he made my stuff better, but it still sounded like me, if that made any sense, makes any sense. And I realized it's because he wasn't necessarily changing my words, he was rearranging them. And what he did made it sound better, but they were still my words.
I think that's something that most writers want, is to feel like it's their work in the end, even though it was improved. I mean, Kevin, you've probably had heavy-handed editors before I have. Steve, I'm sure heavy-handed editors that they end up rewriting every story and it comes out in their voice and you couldn't tell who wrote it in the first place anyway. But yeah, that's the magic of like a great editor in general, but also I think like probably the dream editor for any writer, really.
Yeah. Kevin, may I share an example of where the facts really influenced the structure?
Let's talk about it.
And led to some creativity. I thought of this because just a day or so ago, I saw that Tami Abdollah, who is a former LA Times writer, who's now with USA Today, is going to be honored in just a few months or so by the LA chapter of Society of Professional Journalists. They're giving her a nod for outstanding work, which is really good. Bravo, Tami. So Tami did this feature about an elderly man. He was from Poland, and he a Jewish gentleman from Poland, and he survived World War II. Some of his family members were thrown into the concentration camps, but he survived partly because he kept assuming false identities throughout the war, and he never was actually thrown into a camp. And he was now talking at the Holocaust Museum in LA. So he literally adopted, like he had 5 different names. And the issue was, how do we tell this story? How do we make clear what's going on? And so finally, we were talking about it, and we finally decided, let's just change his name. So at the beginning, we tell you that his name was Solomon Berger, from Krakow or wherever he was from in Poland. And we tell you that he survives because he's going to be changing identities. And then there was a subhead, and it said like Jan Janovitz, 1939-1941. And in that chapter, he's now Jan. Okay.
That's fantastic.
Then he fell in with the Russian army. And then he became Ivan. So then he was Ivan, whatever the, Medvedev, whatever the last name was. And then we had the years 1942-1945. And in that chapter, he's Ivan. Then at the end of the war, I remember the name Shlomo Harari was his name. And he became a Greek Jew for maybe a year. So it was Shlomo Harari, 1945, 1946. And then he becomes Saul Berger. He reduced Solomon to Saul Berger, 1947 to present. And so this man's name literally changed all these times in the story. And it was partly because just the reality, believe it actually made it easier to understand, among the other things. It looked kind of cool and it was very creative, but it was, so anyway, it was an example of where if you really look at what the facts are and let them guide you, they can spur creativity. And so I just love that piece that the guy had 5 different names, or was it 6, whatever it was. Yeah.
Yeah. So for aspiring, national correspondents, find stories of people with multiple identities, I think is the takeaway here, right?
Yes, indeed. Although here's a really interesting thing, if I could quickly tell you. So the gentleman I mentioned earlier, Thomas Curwen, he did something that was the exact opposite with a story. He wrote a piece about a guy. This is not a structural thing, but it's really cool. He wrote a piece about a guy who was an expert in death. He researched attitudes toward death, philosophies and practices concerning death. The man had terminal cancer, so now he was facing his own death. I read the story in the paper. It's really moving, really amazing. And then I look at this photo of him and I noticed the caption, and it jumped out at me because it had his name. And then I realized, was his name in the story? And I went back, and the man's name only appears once in the entire story. And it's maybe in the 3rd paragraph. And then after that, he's just he, him, or it's he, him, his. And I asked Tom later, I said, okay, were you doing that because we're all going to die and you're making him everyman symbolically? Mm-hmm. And he said, yeah, that's what I was doing.
Wow. That is some just master.
Is that like operating on another level? But...
No, and I love reading stories that they become so creative in the storytelling and in the structure. I think there was an Esquire story where it was so simple. They told a story of a man. It's called like Ugly Man or something like that. But it was just about a guy who was not very attractive and about what his life was like being. And I think that they may have done a similar technique of like introducing him in the beginning, and then it was maybe he and him a lot of the way throughout, and you just, I don't know, it felt more intimate in a way, like he wasn't just somebody else. I don't know, it was but that's great advice about letting the facts decide the structure and whatnot. And I think there's also can be a concern of trying to outline and thinking that the information has to stick to the outline, even maybe as you're gathering more of it, or you're doing more reporting, or you make some follow-up calls and you discover something. That's something I think of now is like the outline isn't written in stone.
Right.
And don't become so in love with it that you lose sight of ways in which it can be better. Like it doesn't have to be that way. I've wrestled with that on projects. Like this has to be the ending, and then you get some amazing piece of information you didn't expect, or an extra document came in, or a follow-up interview, or something else. It's like, that's actually the ending. We should ditch this other plan, and we got too married in it in the first place, or maybe I was too married to it in the first place, or whatever. So that's something I'm still thinking about with respect to like planning. Is plans don't have to. They're not set in stone. Just be open to the fact.
I totally agree with that. I think that's really valuable information for anyone watching this day or evening. Yeah.
Yeah, and to that point too, if you have a very creative type of structure, for example, you want to write the story like it was the screenplay from Memento, where everything happens like rewinds back in time, and it doesn't work, don't be married to it. That's the one thing, is just not be married to, it should not be. Here's another Steve Padilla aphorism: clarity over cleverness.
Right? Yes.
So
we, years ago, we did a piece a column one, a guy named Steve Hyman wrote it, who's no longer with the paper, about an elk, a bull elk that had a nickname. It was called Big Daddy because it was this giant elk and he had a harem. And he kind of wandered around the town of Tehachapi, which is about 90 miles or so north of LA. And what happened was I saw a little AP blurb saying that a man had been arrested for poaching, for killing Big Daddy. And all the townspeople were really upset about it. And so the whole gimmick of the story was who killed Big Daddy? I mean, and when we talked about it, we thought to us, it sounded like a Law and Order episode. And so Steve really wanted to write it in the manner of a Law and Order episode, literally in the sense of, there are the prosecutors who do blah, blah, blah. There are the detectives who did that. And it didn't work. It was a clever idea, but it just didn't work. So he wrote it instead, just basically kind of in the style that you mentioned earlier, Kevin, where you start your story. If it's an alphabet, you start at, QRST, to get the attention, then you go back to A and then come through the alphabet. And so he talked about the discovery of the body, of the carcass, and then told you the tale of who killed Big Daddy. And it's still one of my favorite stories. And I'm forgetting now why I even brought this up, but it was a hell of a piece. But the point was we had this idea of doing something clever, and we realized that's not working. So just use this good format of grab their attention with something from the middle of the story, and then go back in time, and then just run it chronological. And that's what made it such a great read. So you can get too clever.
And something you just mentioned, I've written a couple series, and I have learned through them a little bit that there are some classic forms of you begin with kind of a grabbing scene, and then, that's symbolic in a way, and then you back into okay, we got to catch people up, and then we move the story from there, or chronological. I did a 3-part profile of the Boston Celtics head coach, Brad Stevens, and the story, it was just the beginning of his life, and then the middle of his life, and then up till now. That's how it moved, and it worked that way. It was easy to follow, but I wanted to be so clever with it. I was like, I'm going to do all these different things, like these amazing creative nonfiction journalists that I've read and all their work, and you can that can really be toxic in a way. I mean, you talk about getting writer's block when you're trying to make a round peg fit into a square hole because you have what you think is some brilliant idea, and in reality you're just getting in the way of the story, and you're making
that's the
it
danger of
worse
flashbacks. I'm not against them, as a rule. I think they can be effective, but you have to be really careful when you start doing time travel. Yeah. It can get confusing for the reader.
So let's put a
Absolutely.
nice bow on this conversation here. So let's sort of recap some of the things that we talked about, and please sort of add into these points that I'm about to make here. It's always good to think about things in scenes, 3x5 cards, post-it notes. Really consider actually writing it out, and being able I think the tactile advantage, being able to move things around, I think that's definitely an advantage. Don't try to be too clever, clarity over cleverness. Any other thoughts and things to add to those thoughts that we talked about today?
I think the notion of trying to envision the ending, not the words, but the idea early on does help make a lot of those decisions. But one amendment, since we can contradict everything we just said, on the cleverness issue, sometimes clever works, but it only works if it's in service of the story, because that's what it always comes back to. It's got to be for the story.
So to that point, the thing I'd say is I think I love trying to figure out maybe a clever way, and if it works, it works, and if it doesn't, and that's okay. But I would rather try to think of a unique way to tell the story than to just be I'm just going to write this whatever. If it can be done, I want to try to come up with the one thing that I would say that has helped me. All the advice that you gave, Kevin, has been great. I've started to think more about particular sections, and of course, the scene matters. It's so Steve said at the top, you could an entire story, you could have one word, it's that label. I've started to think about like almost individual sections. Like, what is the label that has to do with this particular section?
Ooh, I like
You know,
that.
and there could be
Mhm.
a scene and some information and whatever the case may be that speaks to what that section is about. So like, you know, there could be some, you know, North Star that the entire story is about, and then individual things, as I'm trying to organize the sections themselves, they all have to fit a certain label in and of itself. So that's been helpful to me, again, in trying to organize bunches of information
But one way to keep that all structured is, let me use an analogy that one of our former managing editor at the Times, Mark Duboisson, shared one time, because we were talking about the notion of how do you stay focused and how do you write with authority and yet touch upon side issues. And he said, well, if you're writing, if your story is the Mississippi River, you can mention the Missouri because it's going to flow in to the Mississippi, but don't bring up the Amazon. And I just thought, okay, you know, and the Missouri is a significant river. So you can have that central theme, and yet the way you describe it, have these sub themes that are also pretty damn strong, but they relate, like the Missouri to the Mississippi, right? They relate to the
Yeah.
central one, but don't start bringing up the Nile, you know. And anyway, I just thought when Mark shared that analogy, I thought, oh, that's good.
Yeah,
You know.
That's good.
fantastic.
I'm gonna keep that one.
Well, we are running out of time here. As
Okay.
always, thank you so much for all the comments that you've left, mostly on Steve Padilla's Twitter, which is what, at Steve Padilla 2, I believe, is your Twitter handle.
That's correct.
If you have any ideas, any topics you want us to cover, please let Steve know, and Steve will let us know, and we will be covering this in future episodes. But Baxter, Steve, again, thank you so much. And to all of you watching, thanks for watching the Steve Padilla Sessions, and we will see you next time.